Hey y'all, it's Banksters for Bluefirepoker.com, and welcome to the third episode of my Sit and Go building block series. In this episode we're going to talk about the bubble factor. We're going to look at a simple example of expected value, then we'll look at an introduction to bubble factors and how to calculate them. Then we'll look at a handy little piece of software called the EV and Bubble Factor Calculator. And finally, we'll look at how bubble factors affect our play. Expected value is the backbone of every decision that we make in poker. Whether we're talking about hand strengths or chasing draws or even metagame factors, these are all things that factor in to our decisions, and they all affect our long-term expected value. Our EV can either be positive, neutral, or negative, and generally we should accept positive EV situations and decline negative EV situations. Just like everything else in poker, there are plenty of exceptions, but the general idea in poker is to make the decisions which maximize our expected value as much as possible. EV depends on two main factors, and that's first is the possible outcomes of the hand and the value of our stack in each of these outcomes. The possible outcomes can either be we win the hand, we lose, or we tie. And then we need to think about our stack value after the hand is over. How much it would be worth when we win the hand, how much it could be worth if we lose, and even if we tie the hand, we could still win or lose a small amount. So let's look at an example of how to calculate expected value in one of its simplest forms. We're looking at playing heads up in a sit and go where both players have equal stacks of 6750, and we're at big blind 150, so we're playing pretty deep. We're on the big blind and we've got a crazy guy on the button that is shoving every single time that he is on the button. We have 10-6 suited. Do we call? Well, first we have to check out what the possible outcomes are. If we win, our stack ends up at 13-5. If we lose, our stack is 0 and we're gone. If we fold, our stack remains at 6,600. Then we need to look at how often each of these things will happen. Well, if we bust out Poker Stove, we can see that 10-6 suited versus a random hand will win about 48.9% of the time and lose 51.05% of the time. So if we win the hand, we end up gaining about 6,900 chips versus folding. And like we said, this happens about 48.9% of the time. So if we multiply those two things together, when we win the hand, we on average gain 3,377 chips. Now if we lose the hand, it's actually only a 6,600 chip loss, and this happens about 51% of the time. So that's worth a loss on average of 3,370 chips. Therefore, our expected value for this situation equals the 33 3377 when we win minus the 3370 when we lose, and that gives us an expected value for this hand of 7 chips. And we could end up with an average stack of 6,607 chips. Well, that 6607 is better than the 6600 we would have had we just folded the hand. So this is actually a slightly positive EV call. But note that we are actually still losing money versus where we started the hand, but we are gaining money or chips versus folding. So here we just have a quick screenshot of Sit and Go Wizard confirming that I actually do know how to do some simple math and that I was correct. And we can take note in this situation that we can call with about 53.2% of hands in this situation when we are getting these type of odds against a 100% range. And note that this is in chip equity mode. This is not in ICM mode. So we now know that calling with 10-6 suited in that situation had a slightly positive expected value. In practice, it may be correct to pass up edges that are that small. But how can we figure out how much equity we need just to break even in this type of situation? Well, we can look at the formula for break-even equity, which is our stack when we fold divided by the stack when we win. So in our example, the possible outcomes were we either win and had a stack of 13.5, or we fold and had a stack of 6,600. So in order to break even, we would need about 48.88% equity in the hand. And against villain's 100% shoving range, we saw that we can call with about 53.2% of hands when we looked at it in Wiz. We know that when we're heads up, our chips are equal to our ICM equity value. But how does the ICM affect decisions earlier on in the game? So let's look at an example where we're on the big blind on the bubble and all stacks are equal at 3375. And we're at the BB 400 ante 25 level, so the stacks are all less than 10 blinds. And again, we have the same reckless opponent in the small blind that shoves every single time he is the small blind. And we have 10-6 suited again. Do we call this time? Well, first we need to figure out the possible outcomes, but now we need to use our ICM equity rather than chip values. So if we win, we can figure out that our equity would now be worth 38.44%. If we lose, we bust out and we would have 0% equity. Or if we just fold, our equity would drop down to 22.91%. And we already know that 10-6 suited versus a random hand wins 48.9% and loses about 51%. So when we win, our equity goes to 38.44, and when we multiply that by our win percentage, we get an average equity of 18.81% when we win. If we lose, we drop down to 0%, and obviously 0% is always going to be 0%. So this makes our expected value exactly 18.81%. That's less than the 22.91% equity we would have had if we just folded, so this is a negative EV call. And note that in situations like this, when we are covered and not in the money, the losing side of the equation can be completely omitted because it's always going to be 0. And just to run this hand through Wiz, just to confirm the math, you can see that the equity of a push is 18.81 and the equity of folding is 22.91. And notice that in this hand, even though we're getting a lot better odds, we can only call about 16.9% of hands due to the effects of ICM. So how much equity would we need to break even in this situation? Well, we use the same basic formula, only now we look at what our equity would be if we just fold, and we divide that by what our equity would be if we win. So our winning equity would have been 38.44, folding equity would have been 22.91, and in order to break even, we would now need to win the hand 59.59% of the time. This means that we could only call with the 16.9% of hands that Wiz showed us when villain is shoving 100% of the time. And that's the hand range that would be correct to call with in this situation. But how much equity would we need to call if we were ignoring the ICM? Well, we can use the old break-even equation of our stack when we fold divided by our stack when we win. And in this scenario, the possible outcomes were 6,800 chips or 2,950 chips if we just folded. And that gives us about 43.38% equity needed to break even by chips. So according to the ICM, we needed an extra 16.22% winning chance just to break even. This 16.22% difference is also known as the risk premium, which is a term that's kind of borrowed from the world of finance and investing. And in the world of finance, the risk premium refers to how much return a particular investment should yield compared to a relatively risk-free investment in order to compensate the investor for the risk that is involved in this investment. And the risk-free rate in finance is usually based on something like UST bills, which give you a very low rate of return, but they also have a very low perceived risk involved with them. Well, in poker, our risk-free rate of return can be represented by cash game or heads-up situations where our chip values and dollar values have a direct correlation. But when our tournament equity earlier on in the game is significantly threatened by the risk of losing a hand, we need to be compensated by a much higher rate of return. In this case, that's our win percentage. So we turn to the risk premium to ensure that we receive this extra compensation. The risk premium is very closely linked to another concept called the bubble factor. Bubble factor is based on the fact that ICM changes our pot odds decisions because of the nonlinear values of the chips in a tournament. And we can use the bubble factor to determine just how much these odds get skewed. Bubble factor was introduced in the book Kill Everyone, written by Lee Nelson, Tyson Strebe, and Stephen Heston. And it's a ratio that compares the cost of losing a hand to the gain we receive from winning the hand in terms of tournament equity. And this is also a risk-reward ratio in terms of equity. And this ratio is opponent specific. Unless all stacks at the table are equal, bubble factors will be different for most players at the table. And in fact, two players can have different bubble factors versus each other. So how do we calculate the bubble factor? Well, in our previous example, we saw that we needed an extra 16.22% equity in the hand to call when basing this off of ICM rather than off of pure chip values. And this is due to the fact that the chips won are not as valuable as the chips that we lose according to the ICM theory. And the bubble factor is a way to kind of estimate that difference between the value of the chips won and the value of the chips lost. And it's expressed as our risk divided by our reward. Risk in this context is our equity at the start of the hand, or EQ pre, and that is before the blinds and antes are posted. And then we subtract our equity at the end of the hand if we lose against a specific opponent, and we'll call that EQ lose. And the reward is our equity gained by winning an all-in confrontation versus a specific opponent minus our EQ pre. So in our example, the chips that we lost cost us an amount equivalent to our 25% EQ pre, because we had an equal stack to everyone else at the table with 4 players left, so we had exactly 25% equity before posting. And if we lose it all, so that's 25% risk involved in this hand. But the chips we gained by doubling up through that player only rewarded us about 13.44%, and that's our EQ of win at 38.44 minus our 25% EQ pre. So that gives us a bubble factor of 25% divided by 13.44%, or approximately 1.9. We never really need to get extremely accurate with the bubble factor. It's really just a way to estimate situations. So as long as we have a pretty close ballpark figure, it's usually going to give us something good enough to work with. So what exactly does this mean? Well, we know that thanks to the ICM, losing always hurts us more than winning does, more than winning helps us. So the bubble factor tells us just how much it hurts to lose compared to win. It's always greater than 1 unless we are heads up. And the bubble factor affects our pot odds greatly because we cannot receive rewards in an equal proportion to the risk we are undertaking in a particular hand. So we can calculate just how much the bubble factor adjusts our pot odds by dividing the left side of a pot odds ratio, such as 3 to 1 or 2.5 to 1. We divide that 2.5 or that 3 by the bubble factor. And in our example bubble hand, we had pot odds of 38.50 to 29.50, or about 1.3 to 1. So we divide the left side of that equation by the bubble factor, and our adjusted pot odds become 1.3 divided by 1.9, or about 0.68 to 1. So to convert this to a winning percentage, what type of winning percentage we would need to make that call with those odds, we add 1 and use the inverse. So we would take 1 divided by 1.68, and that shows us, using this bubble factor estimate, that we would need a winning percentage about 59.52%, which is very close to what we figured out in the first example, that we would need about a 59.59% chance of winning. So using these bubble factor estimates gets us very close to the actual value. And this is actually a slightly different method than was presented in the book Kill Everyone. We will look at their method in a little bit. So let's look at another example, and this time we'll just provide you with a bubble factor of 1.5, and we'll say that in this situation we're receiving chip pot odds of 2 to 1. So if we want to figure out what our real pot odds are, we would divide 2 by 1.5, and that gives us real pot odds of about 1.33 to 1. So without the bubble factor, we'd only need to win this hand a third of the time to break even. But when we account for the bubble factor, we need to win actually about 42.85% of the time in order just to break even. And this is because of the effects of ICM. Now we need to win this hand 9.52% more often than in a cash game or a heads-up situation to break even. We can also use an alternative method to see what kind of odds we need when we know our strength versus villain's range. And this is the method that was introduced in the book Kill Everyone. Instead of dividing the left side of the ratio, we now multiply it to see what type of odds we would need to call. So for example, if we think we're 40% against the particular villain's range, we would need odds of about 3 to 2 or 1.5 to 1 to make a break-even call in terms of chips. But if our bubble factor against this villain was 1.4, we would now need about 2.1 to 1 odds to call. So much like the ICM, the bubble factor is pretty impossible to calculate in real time, mainly because it depends on values from the ICM equation. But there are a few tips and tricks we can use to try to estimate what our bubble factor would be. And we can begin to intuitively estimate our bubble factor by being aware of, number one, what the average bubble factor is at different stages of the game. And the averages in this chart are all based on hands where all stacks in the hand are equal. So we can see that at the very start of a tournament where there are 9 players with an average stack of 1,500 chips and all players are equal, every player has a bubble factor of 1.2 against each other. So that means from the very start of the game, pot odds cannot be used purely by chip value. We at least need to start from the very first hand with a bubble factor of 1.2. And as you can see, as it progresses throughout the game, it goes all the way to a peak of 1.88 at the bubble and drops back down once we get into the money. So it's a pretty good idea to commit these average bubble factor numbers to memory, and that way it'll help you to start to be able to estimate your own bubble factor in these different situations. And this is just a graphical format showing you how the bubble factor progresses, how the average bubble factor progresses throughout the tournament. And you can see it's a pretty dramatic increase from 9-handed all the way up to the immediate bubble. And then it's just a completely sharp drop once the bubble has burst. But note that even when we are 3-handed, there still is a bubble factor because the ICM is still applicable at that point of the game. So another way we can get better at estimating our bubble factor is to look for patterns and simple examples. And most of these patterns will hold true throughout the game. The simplest way to look at these patterns is by looking at examples when there are only 3 players remaining, because only the stacks of 2 players matter. The third is automatic. For example, if 2 players have 4,500 chips each, the third player automatically has 4,500. So you really don't even need to think about the third player involved in the equation. Only the 2 very immediate players, yourself and the villain you are trying to calculate your bubble factor against. And if we look at the example bubble factors here for a variety of different situations, we can start to pick out the different patterns that emerge, and these will really help us throughout the game. So let's take a minute to look over this chart, and then we're going to break down some of these specific patterns over the next couple slides. So we can see that when our stacks are equal with the player we're trying to calculate our bubble factor against, our bubble factors are always equal as well. We can also see that when our stacks are below the average stack, our bubble factors approach 1 as they decrease in size. So in the first 2 examples where we both have 1,500 or 3,000 chips, we're lower than the average bubble factor of 1.33, and the lower our stacks get, the lower our bubble factor gets, and it gets very close to 1. And also when our stacks are above average, we have a higher than average bubble factor against each other. So when we both have stacks of 6,000 chips and the third player would only have 1,500 chips at that point, we have relatively high bubble factors of 1.69, which is very close to the average bubble factor on the real bubble. Even though we are already in the money, we still need to be very risk averse against each other in that situation. Another thing we can notice is that when we are covered, when the other player that we're trying to figure out our bubble factor has more chips than us, then our bubble factor is always higher against him than his is against us. And the more we are covered, the higher our bubble factor is against this opponent, and the lower his is against us. So if we look at a couple of these examples, like the first one where we have 1,500 and he has 3,000, well, ours is only 1.6 against him, but his is lower still at 1.04. And we can look even further down the chart where we have a stack of 1,500 and he has 10,500. We have a massive bubble factor against him, and that's 1.83, but his is almost down to 1. It's almost an equal cash game situation for him. So a few more patterns that we can pick out that can really help us start to estimate our bubble factor. Number one is the fact that the bubble factor increases more dramatically the closer we get to the actual bubble, and then it drops off quickly once the bubble has burst. And we saw that in graphical format a few slides ago. Also, the bubble factor drops to 1 when we are heads up. If all players at the table have very close to equal stacks, the bubble factors for all the players will be very close to what the average bubble factor would be. And with no short stacks present at the table, the average bubble factors still give you a fairly good estimate, even if the stacks are spread out and not completely equal. But note that a short stack here means that the stack is very small in relation to the other players and not in relation to the blinds. It doesn't matter if the player has a 1 blind stack or a 20 blind stack. It's only the relationship of their stack to the other players. When there is a short stack present at the table, the bubble factor of all the players at the table deviate away from the average bubble factor. And a short stack typically has a bubble factor approaching 1 unless there is another short stack at the table and they are not involved in a direct confrontation with the other short stack. So if there are 2 short stacks and one of them is against a medium or big stack, his bubble factor is going to be much larger than 1 against that medium or big stack. But when they're involved against each other, their bubble factor is very close to 1. And if there is only 1 short stack at the table, his bubble factor is always going to be close to 1. And all players who may confront the short stack also have a bubble factor approaching 1 versus that particular player. And it doesn't matter how many short stacks are at the table for this situation. If you are not a short stack and you are confronting a short stack, your bubble factor will be relatively low against them. In most situations, it'll be very close to 1. The most significant bubble factors in these games occur between big stacks when they end up in a confrontation. And average or medium-sized stacks always have large bubble factors against anyone that covers them. And when a short stack is present, the bubble factor is increased between players that have similar stacks to each other. So if there are 2 average stacks and then a short stack at the table, the 2 average stacks are going to have much higher bubble factors against each other than what the average bubble factor for the table would be. And we saw that in the example for 3 players where there were 2 players with 6,000 chips and 1 with 1,500. The 2 players with 6,000 chips had much higher than average bubble factors against each other. Finally, the best way to make bubble factor second nature is to analyze a bunch of different situations yourself. And we can do that using a little software program called the EV and Bubble Factor Calculator. And this is an auto hotkey script that was created by a poster on 2+2 that goes by the name Everlong. And you can download the auto hotkey version from overcards.com. That site is down quite often, so I made an exe version that you can download from this site. Okay, I just want to give you a quick little run through of the bubble factor calculator and show you the usage and some of the features. Right off, I want to show you some of the limitations. First of all, it can only calculate bubble factors for hands with up to 6 players, and it has a 9-man payout structure and a 6 max payout structure built in, or you can enter in your own custom payout structure, but it only works up to 3 payout spots. This also works as an ICM calculator, so it will calculate your EV values according to the ICM. But it has the same limitations, only up to 6 players. So let's just look at a couple simple examples real quick just to see how we use this program. So let's look at an even stacked bubble situation where we all have stacks of 33.75, and remember, this is always our stack before any blinds or antes are posted, so it's the stack at the very start of the hand. So we enter in our stacks and just hit calculate, and it shows our bubble factors against each of the other players. Sometimes it doesn't show up with labels, so always make sure you use the reset button in between changing anything, and it zeroes everything out. So then if we go back and enter these values in again, for some reason it's not showing up at all right now. Okay, so I just restarted the program and now all the labels are showing, and this is one of the quirks of the program. It is freeware, so you can't complain and ask for your money back. Just got to deal with it, but it is a useful little tool in learning how to estimate your bubble factors and trying to figure out the effects that these have. You can see that it does calculate our ICM EV in each of these situations. Each one of these players has 25% equity, and it also keeps a running chip total down here so you can make sure you entered in all your stacks properly. So let's just check out a couple more situations real quick. Let's look at a pretty extreme bubble situation where we have 2 average stacks. We have one very short stack, player with only 500 chips, and a clear chip leader that has 6250. So as you can see here, the 2 average stacks have very high bubble factors against each other. Their bubble factor is 2.71, and both players have a very low bubble factor against the short stack. A short stack, their bubble factor against the short stack is only 1.05. But against the large stack, they have a massive bubble factor of 3.23. So what this really boils down to is, as the average or medium stack, you always want to avoid confrontations with the big stack where possible, and really try to pick on other similar stacks or on the short stacks. And notice that almost everyone has a bubble factor very close to 1 against the short stack, and the short stack's bubble factor against us is actually a little bit higher in this situation. Another useful feature of this program is the ability to import straight from hand histories. It will work for PokerStars or full tilt hand histories, and I believe it works for party poker as well. I'm not American, so I am American, so I can't validate that. But you can just copy and paste right into this box and then hit calculate from hand history, and that hand had more than 6 players, so it will give us an instant warning. And it will calculate the values, but it will only show the first 6 players involved in the hand. So you could still get a little bit of an idea from this, but it will leave out the last 3 players. So if you are one of the first couple players listed, it can still be used for full table situations. So let's go back and find a hand that has less than the proper amount of players, so we can look at a couple bubble hands here. And notice how it puts the name of all of the players in the grid, so it makes it pretty easy to tell whose number you are looking at. And you can see in this situation, it's a relatively common bubble situation where there are 3 players that have fairly average stacks, and then one not desperate stack, but he's pretty short. And his bubble factor against everyone is roughly 1.2 to 1.5. And then you can see here that the 2 biggest stacks, the 4260 and the 4065, they have very significant bubble factors against each other of 2.18 or 2.35. So you could really just do some post-game analysis and check out what your bubble factor was in several different situations and see how you played the hand, and really get an idea of how the bubble factor should be affecting your play. And this is just another tool in our arsenal to try to understand these games better and simplify them as much as possible. So I highly recommend using this program, at least for a little bit, just to get yourself familiar with these situations. So now that we have a pretty good idea of how to estimate what our bubble factor is, how does the bubble factor really affect our game? Well, first and foremost, we need to know that the bubble factor is very high in big stack clashes as well as in average or medium stack confrontations. And we can use this fact to our advantage against thinking players that understand the effect of the bubble factor, and we can seize relatively low risk opportunities in these situations and try to play small pots and pick up chunks against players that have relatively large bubble factors against us. We can always avoid getting involved in these type of situations where you feel that you could make a mistake or get outplayed. But if you feel your hand has an advantage against the opponent's range, you should seize this opportunity and become the aggressor by shoving right away, rather than letting yourself get outplayed. In a high bubble factor situation, it's always best to make the first move. As they put it in the book Kill Everyone, it's more like a game of chicken. Whoever is the first one to shove usually has the advantage in the hand. We also need to be aware of any other situation where our opponents have a very high bubble factor against us, and then we can go at them without mercy. Usually our bubble factor will be slightly lower against them than theirs is against us, but even if we both have high bubble factors against each other, if we are the first one to act, usually we can claim the pot. And this is most effective on the actual bubble when we are the chip leader and all of our other opponents will make sensible decisions. In these spots, it can often be correct to shove any 2 cards as the risk of confrontation is so low. So when our bubble factor against the other players is relatively low, but theirs against us is extremely high, then we can really take advantage of this situation. And this is commonly known as poning, or the more common but less politically correct term, raping the bubble. And this is where a whole lot of very successful players make a big percentage of their profits, is by taking advantage of these situations on the bubble and building up their stack as much as possible so that they go into the money with a very significant advantage over their opponents. And when you make the money with such a big advantage, it really, the rest of the game just plays itself. On the flip side of these situations, if we are a medium stack facing a big stack, we need to be very, very cautious, because if we get involved against this player, it will be for our whole stack most of the time. So in these type of situations, we need to avoid pure bluffs, and if we do get involved in a hand, we need to maximize our fold equity by being the first to shove, because we really do not want a confrontation against the opponent that covers us, including even with some of our premium holdings. If you are a short stack facing a confrontation with another short stack, you could treat the game very close to a cash game because our bubble factors are so low against each other. Pot odds are very easy to calculate at this point, and so are pretty much all expected value equations, because there's not much of an ICM effect when our bubble factors are very low. So we can almost use just pure chip values when we have low bubble factors against the other player. When we're the big stack, our bubble factor is relatively low against both medium and short stacks. And the effects of the bubble factor can show that it is correct to attack short stacks wherever possible, but our efforts should definitely be focused at the medium stacks when we are the big stack. We can really abuse the medium stacks in these situations and pick up a whole lot of equity off of them, because they should not be willing to risk as much as the short stacks are. So the short stacks are much more likely to make desperate actions because they are so short, and these actions could be negative EV for the both of us. So we need to be aware of these situations. And remember that it is not our goal to eliminate players in the game. It is our goal to maximize our profits whatever way we can. And if this means not going up against a short stack and letting him live on, then that can be the correct action to take. We also need to remember that when we are eliminating a player at or near the bubble, the other players at the table that weren't even involved in the hand can often benefit as much as we do from the hand, so we need to not give them a free ride. Because of this, it can often be correct to keep the short stack alive so that we can exploit the high bubble factor that this will produce for the other players left at the table. A common example of this is when we're in the small blind and there's a short stack on the big blind, but a medium stack under the gun that is about to hit the blind next. In these type of situations, we can often fold to the short stack, giving him a little bit more padding on his stack, and we do this with the intention of shoving any two cards on the button the next hand in order to take some value away from the medium stack's hand when he is on the big blind. But we need to make sure our opponents will not make mistakes in these type of situations that will cost both of us. So if we feel that our opponents are of the drooler variety, then it usually makes more sense to attack the short stack right away. Against the droolers, we should always play it safe in high bubble factor situations and avoid stealing with our weakest hands, because even if their bubble factor is high, they're usually not very aware of this effect, and they can end up making a very bad call for them that's very negative EV for us, but because they are calling so wide, it actually becomes negative EV for us as well. So much like with the ICM, the best way to get used to bubble factors and to easily estimating what your bubble factor is by simple practice. So you really need to get out there and play a lot of games and make a conscious effort to pay attention to these type of situations and to what your bubble factor is throughout the game. And then after the game, go back and review, and soon enough it just becomes second nature. So for BluefirePoker.com, this has been Die Banksters, and we'll see y'all next time.